Hi, I'm Mercedes Faub at the Captured on Canvas studio. Welcome to Picture This. For today's painting, picture this. We're going to have a clear blue sky, an old vintage truck driving away on a dirt road with a load of big pumpkins, and we're going to frame this piece with a little bit of wheat going up the sides of the canvas. Before we get started, we'll make sure we have everything sitting in front of us. Most importantly, on my easel, I have my blank 16 by 20 canvas standing vertically. Next, I'm going to have a cup of water as well as a sponge for cleaning my brushes. For my paintbrushes, I'm going to be using, almost a handful. I'm going to have two different large size brushes. One is going to be about 1.25 inches. One of them is only about 3/4 inch. And then we're going to have a middle size angular brush, and last but not least, a really tiny round brush for tiny detail. Then on our paint palette, we're going to have a very fall palette. A lot of browns and warm fall colors. So we are going to start with a lot of our white, black. We're going to have some turquoise. These are going to get a little confusing, but we do have a raw sienna. I like to call that my golden yellow. Then I have my burnt sienna, which is more of a burnt reddish brown. We have burnt umber, so I like to call that my chocolate brown. And then last but not least, I have a nice metallic copper. So before we get started, I always like to think of my background, plan that out. So we're going to start with that and then work on the closest thing last later. So with my background, I do want a nice soft, just kind of faded in sky blue color. So I'm going to start with my largest brush here, and I'm going to start with a big scoop of white. So I'm going to take a big old scoop of white because sky blue is a nice light color. I'm going to take a little bit of turquoise on the corner of my brush and mix that in. I think that's probably good right there. So I'm just going to wipe off some of this extra paint. And then I'm going to use my brush standing up, and I'm just going to do soft movements left and right with just a slight arch. I'm going to have my horizon probably about 1/3 the way up. So I'm just going to start in the middle and flick to the left and to the right. And I'm going to have this kind of fade away to white around the edges, kind of creating a vignette. So I'm just going to focus through the middle, flicking left and right. And I'm going to bring that up until I'm about maybe a couple inches away from the top. Okay, so right about here I'm going to stop. And notice that really softness that I have at the edges. If that didn't work out so much for you, you can always go back and blend in some white, but I'm pretty happy with how mine turned out. So I'm going to move on to the next step, which is cleaning my brush. Now for our next step of the background, I'm going to create that dirt ground. That is just going to be down here in the middle with kind of a medium brown tan color. So back to my palette, I am going to just do a little bit more of the mixing on the canvas this time. So I'm going to use that big brush, and I'm going to dip into that burnt umber or that chocolate brown. And I'm going to start doing exactly kind of the same thing as I did with the sky, but I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way up, having just a slight arch to it. With it too, we want to give it a little bit of depth. Sometimes I lift it up on that little edge to get to the bottom easier. But I'm going to bring it in narrow. So if we want to kind of sketch in just a little bit of where that path is going to go, kind of comes from the corners and aims in towards the center of the canvas. So that at least we'll get that perspective like as if it's going away from us. So I'm going to start with just a little bit with that brown going back and forth. I'm going to blend in just kind of anywhere throughout that path. We can kind of go out beyond that line too. We don't have to be perfect. So with our wheat, we'll still have dirt over there underneath our plants and our wheat. And randomly, I'm just going to dip into my white, not too much, and blend that in a little bit in spots as well. Okay, so now that I finished my dirt, I'm gonna go ahead and wash off my brush again. And for my next step of the background, I'm gonna go ahead and actually start with that wheat and build that up so that when we paint in our truck, at least he can be in front of some of that in the far distance. I'm gonna use my large, or I guess my 1-inch large flat tip brush, and I'm gonna use that raw sienna or that golden yellow to create just kind of like almost tall grass on the side to get started. So I'm gonna get that on there and I'm gonna fold that brush back and forth to get that nice little point to that brush so we can make nice thin lines. And I'm just gonna start flicking up on the left and in the right. As it's further away, I want them to be shorter, and as I come closer, I'm gonna make them taller. So they're actually gonna stand about halfway up on the canvas. Don't be as shy to make them tall. Naturally, sometimes we wanna make it shorter, but let's make sure to make it nice and tall. So using the thin side of my brush, standing vertically, I'm just gonna flick that brush up. And with this, I'm gonna alternate the direction of each of those little, I'm gonna just call it grass for right now, because that's kind of what it looks like. Or we can call it stems. And I'm gonna start really close to that path down there, and then just kind of dance that across. Okay, so right away I'm going to dip into the chocolate brown, that burnt umber. I always have to think about it as well. So I'm gonna use this without cleaning my brush. I'm just gonna use a little bit of this dark brown and also fluff in a little bit of that color at the base of the wheat. But I'm only gonna go about halfway up. So just now that I added that little shadow, we're gonna go ahead and clean off our brush before we do one little thing to make this look more like wheat. I am gonna move to my middle-sized angular brush, and I'm gonna go back to that raw sienna or that golden yellow. And up at the top of some of the stems, I'm just gonna be picking at random. I'm gonna create those little wheat tops, and they're all gonna be just with one little touch of the brush and to create each kind of little leaf on it. So up at the top, I'll start with one going vertical, and then to the left and right, I'm almost gonna think of it like a V or a zipper, kind of alternating down, kind of rotating that brush from side to side. And like I said, I'm just gonna pick a few at random. You know what, sometimes I like making them float. Kind of just fills that space a little bit. So if it's kind of blurry and far away, we might not see that stem. And honestly, you don't even have to put it in line with anything. As it comes down, you can place them wherever. There's no rules with art. All right, so that finishes our background. While we let that dry, we'll take a little break. Welcome back to Picture This. I had just finished my background and creating this fall painting I'm going to be creating with a pickup. So the next step we're going to do is create the old vintage truck and start the pumpkins within the truck as well. So with this, I am going to be using my 1-inch brush here that is flat, and I am going to be mixing kind of a rustic orange brown, almost kind of a pastel shade though. So with this, I'm going to start with a big scoop of white. And I did decide to add a little bit of orange to my palette because pumpkins are orange, so we need a little bit of that too. So we're going to take a little bit of orange to mix that in. It's got a nice pasty orange there. And to make it a little more rustic, I always like adding my burnt sienna. So a little bit of that. I'm going to mix that in. So I feel this is pretty good for me. With this, I am going to start drawing the back of my pickup. So to get started, I got the tailgate. It's just going to be a nice wide rectangle across my canvas. So for this, I want to make sure I'm starting beneath my horizon so I don't have a floating truck. That's really important. So I'm going to come down about maybe 1 inch or 2 over my path here. I'm gonna use this brush to start from the center, and I'm gonna draw a straight line left and right, just a little bit wider than my path. So for measurements, it's probably about 2 hands width wide. I'm gonna make the walls of my box. I'm gonna go up, both sides, maybe about the width of my hand, 3, maybe 4 inches. And then I'm gonna finish that with a straight line across the top. Then I'm gonna go ahead and just color this in. Okay, so for my next step here, I'm gonna draw the cab of the truck. Because it's gonna be far away, we're looking at the back, it's gonna be not as wide. So with this color, I'm just gonna make a couple marks, maybe about 1/4 of the way in from the right and about 1/4 of the way in from the left. I may go out just a little bit. We don't wanna be too narrow. And I'm just gonna use the thin side of my brush, rotate around to draw that top of the cab. I'm gonna angle in the sides just a little bit. I might apply a little bit more pressure to thicken that line a little. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna leave this middle open so that it's kind of like the window then. Do the same thing on this side. Thicken it up. And then I'm just gonna round these corners and draw across to the right and curve down into that right line there. And I'm just gonna go through and kind of refine it. I might widen this out towards the outer edges there. Okay, so for my next step here, it's gonna be drawing in the tops of the wheel wells. So this is just gonna be like a candy cane shape. Coming about halfway up here, I'm gonna go to the left just a smidge, curling down, and then I'm just gonna go a little bit beneath this bottom edge of the tailgate, and I'm just gonna make a nice little smile going over and then straight up back into the back of the tailgate and color that in. One more thing I'm gonna do to finish off the drawing of my pickup here is I'm gonna rotate that brush vertically, or using the vertical thin side of the brush, I'm gonna hold it horizontal and I'm gonna go back and forth to create a nice thin line right across the top here, and I'm gonna go out just a little bit to the left and the right to create that little ledge. And next, because we're working with similar colors, I'm gonna work on adding the pumpkins in the back here. So because my first pumpkin I wanna make kind of orange, I'm gonna continue with this color, but I'm gonna darken it a little bit so that it'll vary from my pickup a bit. So I'm just gonna take that brush, add a little bit more orange to my pickup color. If you wanna save a little bit for later, that might not be a bad idea, just in case you need it. And then I'm gonna go ahead and take a little bit of that burnt sienna and add that in as well to keep that rustic tones. Again, try to keep it a nice little pile. And I'm gonna start drawing my pumpkin. I wanna make sure my pumpkins look like they're sitting in the truck bed, so I'm only gonna be drawing more of the tops, just kind of like the top of a heart basically is all we're doing here. I want them to be really big though, so I'm gonna start kind of halfway up my cab, maybe offset to the right a little bit. And if you want to use a smaller brush, feel free to do that. I just like using the big ones. So I'm gonna round up and bring it down to the top, and I'm gonna mirror that on the other side. Might make one side bigger than the other so it looks like it's tilted. You know, whatever works. And I'm gonna draw a straight line across the top, and then I'm gonna color it in. All right, and one more thing I'm gonna add to that pumpkin is 2 little bumps on the middle here, so that when we outline this, you'll see that we're kind of looking more at the top of the pumpkin. So I'm just gonna add those little guys. And then I am going to clean my brush and prepare for my second and maybe even third pumpkin. Okay, so for my next pumpkin, I'm gonna do right over here on the left side. I'm gonna kind of create more of a greenish pumpkin. So continuing with that same brush, unless you like a smaller brush, go use that. But I'm gonna start with the raw sienna, that golden yellow, separating that. And I'm gonna add a little bit of teal to create a green, and even adding a little bit of white. Okay, so we're gonna continue those same steps just like we did our first pumpkin. But for this guy, because we're really starting to squeeze them in, I'm gonna make it a little bit more angled. And honestly, if you don't have room for more pumpkins, you don't have to do that either. Okay, so I'm just gonna round over here and make another bump over the top of that orange pumpkin. I'm just gonna follow along that pumpkin and across the tailgate and color in. And one more thing, just like the orange one, I'm gonna draw those two little bumps, making sure they're not too tall either, but just kind of filling those in the middle, no taller than that left and right side of the pumpkin. And I'm gonna go ahead and, actually, I'm gonna take a little bit of teal and darken that and add a little bit of shadow while it's wet. I was thinking we could wait, you could, but sometimes I like it when it's wet on the canvas yet so we can blend it. I'm gonna start from the middle and just kind of flick down and create the creases. That's the thing with art. Sometimes I change my mind of what I'm doing when I'm doing it, and sometimes it just works out different each time. It's kind of fun to see what happens. So just that subtle shadow. Go ahead, clean off my brush, and I'm gonna start my last pumpkin up there in the top. It's gonna be kind of a toned down turquoise. So it's kind of like my sky color. I do need to mix more. I'm gonna start with white and add a good portion of that teal. I'm gonna make it a little darker than my sky. And to tone it down, instead of using black, I'm actually gonna use that burnt umber. Kind of like that more fall tone it gives it. And that's probably good right there. So what I'm gonna do is make my third pumpkin just the same way I did before. Looks like I'm kind of running out of space. I'd like not to cover the whole top of my cab there. So I'm gonna make it a little short, just kind of like he's peeking up behind. And the last little step we're gonna do here before we do all of our fun details is we're gonna add a little bit more to our cab here, creating more of that rustic look and actual rust itself. So with that 1-inch brush, I'm gonna use a lot of dry brushing here. So making sure my brush is really dry. I'm gonna start with teal, or that turquoise, just as is. I'm gonna get a little bit on that brush, dabble it off the edge of my palette. And with this dry brushing, we want almost a dry brush, and we're gonna just flake down really light pressure. So some areas I'm gonna add this is kind of towards the tops of my wheel wells, using the width of my brush, holding it horizontal, just softly flicking down, kind of like this was its old paint color. And we'll clean our brushes. I'm gonna add a little bit kind of more of rust color with that burnt sienna, that reddish brown, and doing exactly the same thing. We just wanna kind of go next to the teal so we're not covering all that teal that we just did. I'm gonna clean my brush, and there's one more little part that I love. I'm gonna use that middle-sized brush, and I'm gonna use that metallic copper. I really like that because it actually almost has that rust look and the shimmer to it. So with a little bit of this color, I'm just gonna add a little bit of rust, more defined around the edges of the truck here. Definitely take a step back and look. It's one of those steps that I love to do, and I love shimmer, but You don't want to do too much either. And last but not least, if you see the top of your cab, don't forget that area there. Alrighty, so that just finishes our pickup for right now. While that dries, we'll take a little break. Welcome back to Picture This. I'm in the middle of working on a fall haul painting with my old vintage truck and some pumpkins. I am actually going to be working on the final touches here to create outlines and all of the fine details. So to get started, with that step, I'm going to use my middle-size angular brush. I love this brush for fine lines because it holds more paint, but sometimes that small brush might work better for you as well. With this, I am going to be using black, but to make those lines more fluid, I do think it's helpful to water down that black. So what I'm going to do is take a little bit of black and plop that somewhere separate on my palette. Take that brush, dip it in my cup of water, and mix that in. We just want it to be a little bit more fluid. Try not to water it down too much though, because then it becomes too transparent and might actually run down your canvas as well. And I'm just gonna work on outlining. I'm gonna start with my pumpkins and I'm gonna work my way down on my pickup here. So with the pumpkins, we are gonna start our outlines for the creases down into the pumpkin a little bit because I'm actually looking more at the top of my pumpkin. So I'm just gonna start from the one side and I'm gonna curve it up and swoop down into it a little bit and do the same thing for the other side. And I'm just going to outline that other side, those little bumps, and I'm going to add these little creases throughout my pumpkin as well, kind of keeping it that nice arch. So as I start from the right, it's going to be curved out to the right, left to the left, and as it comes through the middle, they kind of straighten out like that, kind of like a fountain. I'm going to do that for each of the pumpkins here. Okay, so now I'm going to continue with outlining the rest of the pickup here. So I'm going to start with this line right across the top. And while I'm there, I may as well add a little license plate. So I'm going to use the width of my brush here. I'm just going to add in like this black rectangle here down in this corner and color it in. Just going to partially outline a little bit across the top of my cab, or you can outline the whole thing. Sometimes I don't like to outline too much. You know, it's more of a shadow sometimes versus an outline. And I'm going to continue to create the wheels. So with the black, we can still use that watered down. And the wheels, the tires, are going to come down just a little bit in from the sides of the wheel well. I'm going to bring it down just a little bit, maybe curving in just a smidge. And then I'm going to draw that straight line going left and right. And I'm going to color it in and then mirror that same thing for the other wheel. Okay, so with the next step, we can continue with the black and use the same brush. We're going to go back to that weed a little bit and just add a little bit more with the shadow. And just like in the beginning, we're going to do soft flicks going up just to kind of darken up that bottom, creating more of a shadow. Okay, so one more thing that I almost always forget about that pickup is it has to have the rear view mirrors. So over to the left here, I'm just gonna draw just a little, almost side of a rounded rectangle over there. And that's what that is. So I'm just not gonna color it in. I'm gonna leave it the background color because then it looks kind of like that mirror coming through. Now with this brush or a tiny brush, I'm going to bounce back and forth depending on how big I want the little vines coming from my pumpkin. So do your best judgment. I'm just going to make these to fill in more of the top portion of my canvas because we got a lot going on down here. So with this, I'm gonna start from whichever pumpkin you want, and I'm just gonna draw those loop-de-loos. They can alternate each side to side. So with the next step, I'm gonna add in little leaves, and just like I did the wheat, I'm basically gonna just make the leaves with a couple touches with this brush. So I'm just gonna choose wherever I want to put them. Again, I kind of like them floating just to fill the space in the best way. So wherever I want, I'm just gonna start with a middle line using the thin side of my brush. And then to the left, I'm gonna angle out nice and close and angle out to the right. I'm gonna go ahead and clean off my brush. With that middle-sized brush, I'm gonna mix some gray to make the actual bumper to my truck. So with this, I'm gonna start with white and add a little bit of black until I get a nice gray that I like. And I'm just gonna use the width of my brush and just draw a fat line all the way across from one side to the other. And it can stick out a little bit from the tailgate, just right underneath that outline, so then we don't have to outline the top of it. Okay, and with that gray, why don't we add a little bit of the raw sienna, kind of create like a warm tan gray color to add a little bit of highlights to the leaves. Using the same technique we did before, but with a little less paint and a little less pressure, we can add a little bit to one side of the leaves. Let's go ahead and clean off our brush. At this time, I would start thinking about what you want to put in your license plate, because really you can make it whatever you would like. But before I do that, I'm going to outline my bumper. So with a little bit of black, watered down again, tiny brush, I'm just going to outline the rest of it. And for me, in the license plate, I'm just gonna do like I heart fall, just something nice and simple for fall. I'm gonna choose to use white, but really you could use whatever color you would like. Really light pressure, I'm gonna do my very best to write in there. And nice and small, make sure you don't run out of space. The heart, I just kind of make a V with a little bit more pressure. And then fall. And with the white, one more thing we can do yet is add a little bit of highlight to our bumper. You know, the details you can add in this painting are so fun. You can just keep going. It's fun to add some maybe to the tops of the pumpkin. And I think I'm feeling pretty good about mine, but before you're done, an artist always signs their work. I always like to use my small brush to sign, and I'm gonna choose black for this one today, watering it down. And I do sign my full name, so just gonna write that down in the corner. And there we are. And that is our Fall Haul masterpiece. Thank you for following along with me, Mercedes Fabre, at the Captured on Canvas studio. We'll see you next time on Picture This.
Give it a minute.